Yes, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, the home of old school vintage motorcycles, and we've got quite a lot going on here at CDB TV at the moment. We're still in catch-up mode from all of the stuff that we filmed in June, but we're eventually making our way through it. But just now we're going to take a look at a bike that I came across while I was at a local motorcycle show in Kirkcaldy in my home county of Fife just recently, and I was quite intrigued when I came across this bike because this was certainly for me the very first time that I'd seen one of these machines. So let's get straight into that now and take a look at Bruce Lindsay's lovely 1974 Italian Laverda Chott 250. Anyhow, as I just mentioned, I just happened to come across this bike while I was at a local bike show in my area, where it was the local Kirkcaldy Motorcycle Club that was holding their annual show at the town's ice rink, although thankfully there was no ice on the floor this time round, just a few old vintage and classic motorbikes. Now, one of the reasons that attracted me to this particular bike, that it was the only off-road bike that was actually on display on the day. Now, there were a couple of little trials bikes on show as well, but this one here was about as near as I could get to a scrambles or enduro type machine. But then again, the more I looked at this bike, the more I became intrigued with its construction, because I did come across a couple of Laverdas on my travels down the years, and I think I've at least covered one other Laverda off-roader on my YouTube channel, which was a 1978 LH4 motocrosser, which had a Husqvarna engine in the chassis. But for me personally, this was another very rare Italian beast, so I just had to try and find out a little bit more about it. So the bike's current owner is Bruce Lindsay, and Bruce told me that he bought the bike in April of 2025, and he's only just recently re-registered it here in the UK, and he's currently waiting on the official documents and the brand new registration plate arriving from the DVLA. Anyhow, according to Bruce's information, this bike supposedly began its life in the UK, but was then shipped over to the Netherlands, where it spent much of its life as an exhibit in the Cordi's Laverda Museum. Now, the machine sometime later was then sold to a local rider who used it at local scrambles and enduro events, before he then decided that he was getting a bit too old to race bikes, and once more this bike was then placed into his own private collection, before eventually ending up in our current owner's hands, Bruce Lindsay. But of course, Laverda are more well known for their big bore road bikes that they built back in the 1970s, like their very successful big Jota 4-cylinder monster. But as with many other manufacturers of the time, motocross racing was big business in the 1970s, and Laverda certainly wanted a piece of that action and decided to go ahead and build their own off-roader. So in essence, this was Laverda's very early attempt at producing a scrambles or enduro machine, which was certainly a fully Italian designed frame and engine. But when it came to 1978, Laverda would then use a Swedish Husqvarna engine in their off-road machines. So to begin with, this 1974 250 Chott, as you can see, had quite a small bore steel tubular frame, which when you look at it looks almost bicycle sized, and it certainly doesn't have the look of a motorcycle that could take all manner of abuse over rough and bumpy racetracks. But there was one other intriguing factor about this Chott 250 chassis, in that it had a fully adjustable headstock so that you could shift it to suit different tracks and rider preferences, and it could be adjusted at 25 degrees, 27.5 degrees, or even 30 degrees. So a quite innovative design for the mid-1970s, and whether it made a lot of difference to the actual handling of the overall bike, I'm not too sure. But it is said that the name Chott that was chosen for this bike was taken from a region in North Africa where the bike was developed and tested. So as we move on to our Laverda's power plant, which was a single cylinder two-stroke that had magnesium crankcases, a 5-speed gearbox, and twin spark self-generating electronic ignition, which was pretty high tech for 1974. And I did actually forget to mention that it was a 250. But here at this side of the engine, you can see the drive mechanism and the cable for the speedometer. And to pump the fuel into this piston port engine, it used an Italian-made Delotto carburetor to feed it with its pre-mixed fuel. And because this is an Italian thoroughbred, it uses quite a lot of Italian-based parts. And the Delotto carburetor drew its air supply from a foam air filter that was inside the plastic airbox that I'm guessing it was either accessed from underneath the bike seat or by removing one of the bike's side panels. Now, once more, it was just a simple kickstart there to get the engine fired into life. And according to what I've read on my research of these bikes, they claim that these Chott 250s had a dry clutch inside this casing. But when you take a look at this shot here, you can clearly see that this one's got an oil filler and level plug. So maybe this 1974 bike is some kind of upgraded version of the Chott 250, because if it was a dry clutch inside this casing, I can imagine that there'd be no means to be able to keep it cool. Plus, you'd also need some kind of lubricant to oil that rev counter drive as well. So my deduction here is that this is almost definitely a wet oil cool clutch on this 1974 250. So one other feature of our 250 Chott engine is that it also has twin spark ignition, which is basically just to try and make the fuel-air mixture burn a bit more efficiently. And it's also titled a self-generating electronic ignition system that I expect is just some kind of precursor of our modern day ignition systems. And it's also got a decompressor fitted, which is a bit unusual on a smaller 250, because those are usually used on the much bigger 500s just to try and reduce the compression and make them a bit easier to turn over for starting. Anyhow, according to the write-ups of these Laverda 250 engines of 1974, this two-stroker here was said to be a tad underpowered as a serious off-road enduro or scrambles engine, and for its day I think it was rated at around the 26 horsepower mark, and I do remember its bore and stroke was 68 millimeters. But I suppose with its exotic magnesium casings and the twin spark ignition and a 5-speed gearbox. It certainly appeared to have what was required for a 250 off-road racer, and as far as I'm aware, these 250s did have this matte black barrel and head, and of course this nicely coloured gold bottom end that made it stand out from some of the other European bikes that were currently on the tracks in 1974. But this was another quite nice touch on this Laverda engine, with this kind of plastic exhaust guard that ran underneath the engine to protect that low slung expansion chamber from being battered by stones and other crud thrown up from the track, because you can imagine without it this pipe would suffer severe damage. And I'm guessing that because this plastic guard's been in place on this bike since 1974, and because the bike's only done about 1,300 kilometres in the last 51 years, I'll wager that this expansion chamber will be like brand new if you were to remove this guard. Now, the tailpipe itself appears to be made up of two separate sections that can be separated from each other, probably just to enable the pipe to be split and then repack it with new exhaust packing. But as you can see, it looks like a quite heavy bugger, which was another complaint about these 250 Chotts in 74. They do say that despite it just being a 250, it still weighed around the 260 pounds mark, even although it had some magnesium in parts of its construction. And so I suppose this pipe and the header pipe that went into the engine's barrel just added to the all-up weight of our Laverda Enduro Racer, which, as you know, isn't a good thing if you're looking to put together a lightweight and flickable off-road machine. Right, and so as we move on to the front end of our 250 Chott, and because this is another Italian-built bike, we've got more Italian parts here in the shape of a pair of Seriani yokes or triple clamps, and of course their associated Seriani forks as well. Now, as you're well aware, these Serianis were super popular suspension units in the 1970s, and were not only used on these Italian bikes, but many riders in the UK fitted these forks onto their Rickman frame kits when they were putting together their Rickman racers. And although these Serianis were effectively 1970s suspension technology, they did work surprisingly well, especially on these much lighter 250s. And staying here at this front wheel now, as per the engine's crankcases, both the front and the rear hubs on our Laverda are again made from magnesium, just to try and shed more precious grams of weight from our 250 Laverda. And again, the brakes were your old school drum and shoe setups that for their time still did quite a good job of slowing or stopping our enduro bike when it was in flight. And as I said, the rear hub also was cast in magnesium, and that was another drum and brake shoe type unit. But of course, these old school brakes didn't have the stopping power of our modern day hydraulic motorcycle brakes, because this, as I said, was the 1970s, and this, unfortunately, was the bike braking technology of its day. So as we make our way to the opposite side of the bike's rear transmission, both this rear sprocket and its drive chain, as you can see, were protected from the elements with this kind of metal guard that covered the sprocket, and of course those rubber gaiters there that kept all the dirt, dust and moisture from wearing out the drive chain. So again, these were all quite good ideas by Laverda to keep these parts protected from the elements, but of course these just added precious weight to this bike, which of course many other enduro racers of the time didn't have. And moving on to the bike's rear end, we have more Italian suspension units this time, a pair of Corti Cosso rear shocks that, as I remember, weren't the best even in 1974, because I remember my old Michael did have a pair when I first bought it, and all that those shocks were really good for was holding up the back of the bike when it was parked in my garage. But these Corti Cossos had minuscule amounts of adjustment, which only really made the springs softer or harder, but in reality these were never up to the right specification for use on an off-road bike. So as I said, probably best keeping them handy around the workshop and just use them for the purpose that I just previously mentioned. And just in case you're remotely interested, both of the wheels on Bruce's 250 Laverda are Borum alloy wheels, and he's got a 21-inch Metzler tyre fitted to the front and an 18-inch Metzler on the back as well. That could quite possibly even be the stock originals, because this old classic here hasn't got a lot of miles under its belt, so who knows, these may still be the original items. Nevertheless, the Chott's fuel tank, I'm guessing, is a steel or possibly even an alloy tank, and it certainly looks like it could hold a decent amount of pre-mixed gas, because some of those enduros of the time could be quite long and cover a fair distance, so naturally you'd need a decent sized fuel tank to complete all of the different stages without stopping for gas or a fill up. So again, more originality on Bruce's lovely Laverda. And as you can see, our little 250 definitely appears to have all of its original parts, including this small leather pouch here to put maps and other documents in to help you find your way around the different enduro stages. So certainly no sat navs or Google Maps in those days. This was old school, and you had to use your brain in some dead reckoning to get from the start to the finish line. And because this particular Laverda was also registered for the highway, it of course had to have a full lighting kit and functioning speedometer to enable it to be used on the road. Although our Bruce Lindsay bike has the added addition of having a rev counter as well, so this machine could even be used as a fun commuter bike when it's not digging the dirt at a classic scramble or enduro. So the road going parts of this bike will come in very handy for that specific purpose. And again, you can see more original parts here on our 74 Laverda with the stock switch gear to operate those lights, and the levers and their covers are once more the self-same components it had when it left Laverda HQ 51 years ago. So it's a rare item to have things like these old school light switches still in place after all those years and all of those track excursions that this bike probably had during its life. But the bike's handlebars and other controls like the grips and throttle gasser are once again more evidence that this is indeed a Laverda time capsule from the mid 1970s, because as far as I can make out, I just can't find one single part on this bike that wasn't bolted onto it when it left the Laverda factory all those years ago, because you'd expect that these kind of wearable components would have been changed at least once in its lifetime. So even although this is an original bike, you certainly don't expect it to still have these parts still in place. Even so, you can see that the bike's seat doesn't even look like it's been repaired or recovered during its years of use, but then again, this bike has been stored for a big percentage of its life, so I expect that that's why this is in such good condition. And here at the back, the rubber mounted tail light. Bruce, as I said, has just had the bike registered for use in the UK, so he's just waiting on his documents coming back, and he'll be able to fit a proper UK year of manufacture number plate here on the back. Now, they do say that there were around 5,000 of these Laverda 250 Chotts made between 1974 and 1976 in various configurations, although there were only a handful imported into the UK, which I suppose is one of the reasons that you never ever see one. And for me personally, this is my very first encounter coming across one of these rare Italian ponies, and I expect that I'll not see another one for quite some time. Although, having said that, these 250 Laverda Chotts were only made for those 2 years between 74 and 76, so it had a very short production run, and I think it was replaced in 1976 by the much more basic Laverda 250 TR2, which was basically the same bike, although Laverda then took away all of the exotic parts like the magnesium casings and the hubs and all the road going parts, and they also removed the speedo and some of the other parts, and all of the metal parts that were used for the bike's side panels were then replaced with plastic to try and reduce the bike's weight. Anyhow, when I decided to take myself along to this classic bike show, I more or less knew that there wouldn't be much in the way of off-road bikes, because most other years that this show has been on, it's been geared to mainly vintage road or road racing machines. But of course, a good YouTuber never leaves the house without his camera in tow, because you never know what you might come across. And thankfully for me, it's certainly paid dividends this time around. So although Laverda did have a go at joining the Motocross Dirt Bike League with their off-road creations, unfortunately they were completely outclassed by the rest of the European opposition, because the likes of Husqvarna and Bultaco and even some of the British brands like CCM were all making much better bikes, and Laverda did have a lot of catching up to do if they were going to market a bike that would sell in decent numbers. But it wasn't even the European bikes that were Laverda's opposition, because even in 1974 some of the big Japanese manufacturers like Honda were beginning to flood Europe and the UK with their fantastic CR250 Elsinores that were selling in massive numbers. And for a niche manufacturer like Laverda, although their road bikes were very popular in the 1970s, these Enduro 250 Chotts never really had the same appeal, unfortunately. But let's not lose track of just how rare this bike is, because, as I said, there was only about 5,000 of these Chotts manufactured, and you can certainly count on one hand the few that were brought to the UK, and who knows, this might even be the only one in the country. And as far as I know, Bruce's intention is just to get the bike legally registered for the road and then use it at the occasional off-road enduro or maybe classic race event. So who knows, we may even bump into it on our classic dirt bike TV travels. But again, this is a lovely piece of off-road history and a super rare and exquisite piece of Laverda motorcycling history, and I'm glad that I managed to capture it and share it with all of my viewers here at CDB TV. And there you have a nice little picture there of the bike's new owner, Bruce Lindsay, justifiably proud, posing next to his Laverda 250. And actually, I only just learned on the day that Bruce lives not that far away from me, so it's certainly a small world when you meet somebody with such a rare machine that only lives a short car journey away. But without doubt, Bruce's Laverda was certainly getting some attention over the course of the day, and it wasn't because it was the only rare off-roader in among many vintage road bikes, because many of the punters who were looking it over, they were quite intrigued as to its origins, and they were also quite well impressed with its pedigree and originality. So it really just goes to show you that although some of these smaller local bike club shows are based on the kind of motorcycles that the club use in their normal day-to-day running of their events, you just never know what kind of hidden gems might appear if you just take the time to go along and have a quick browse. And in my case here, I'm quite glad that I made the journey to document this lovely and quite rare piece of Italian motorcycling history.